All right, so welcome back. We are going to continue our discussion of what happens during infancy. And last week we focused a lot of time on what happens with the physical growth and development of an infant post-birth. And this week we're going to delve a little bit more into how their brains start functioning and relating in relation to their behaviors and their thoughts and their memories and those sorts of things. So this is chapter 5, and this is going to be cognitive development. And I do have, I always struggle with the approach that I want to take with explaining how cognitive development happens, because before we get into personalities, before we get into emotions and thoughts and decision making and reasonings and morals, we really have to start building routines, and we do that through a process that we call learning. Now, there are different approaches to teaching how learning occurs. And this book, I like how it breaks it up into time frames, into stages within the lifespan of development or development of lifespan through the person's life. However, it doesn't really go into talking about some of these stages, like these stage theories, like Jean Piaget. We'll talk a little bit about Jean Piaget. But I'm not going to go through all of the stages today because they don't apply. We're talking about infancy, which is about 0 to 2 years of age. So we're going to really just focus on one of these stages. So I just want to let you know that I may be glossing over some of these stages, especially when I talk about Jean Piaget, and later we'll talk about Erik Erikson and maybe even Lawrence Kohlberg's. I'm just going to be talking about the stages that apply to the ages. If that, that kind of rhymed, I liked it. So anyway, just keep that in mind. I'm not like spinning over some of these stages. If you're familiar with them, I'm just trying to conserve a little bit more of the topic when it's going to be appropriate to talk about it later. Okay, if that makes sense. So I'm going to share my screen with you. All right, and hopefully, can y'all see chapter 5 in my screen?
Yes.
Okay, good. All right, let me move some things around here so I can see everybody's face as I'm talking to you. All right, so as I mentioned, this is going to be really focused on cognitive development in infancy. And later we're going to talk about how social aspects and cultural aspects play into the development of children as well. Because we're not only developing them socially, we're developing them through a learning model. And it could be whatever learning model that we've instituted. Many of us, some of us have probably grown up right around the era where I did, where there was a lot of trial and error for us, wasn't there? There wasn't really a lot of things that were given to us. Like I grew up in rural Pennsylvania, where I was able to explore a lot of things on my own. And for the most part, I think many of us from Pennsylvania probably have experienced that. If you're outside of Pennsylvania, you probably have different experiences, like especially if you're from Philadelphia, New York, or Pittsburgh, right? You didn't have a lot of room to explore in those areas. We didn't have really the influence of media. We did have a little bit of media back then, but not nearly what it is now. Everybody's connected now. So things have really changed as far as the model of cognitive development, not necessarily the model of cognitive development, but how we developed in relation to our culture in our society, right? And I know even some of you are from outside of the United States, and your culture probably has different traditions and ways of teaching children as well, right? I think we covered last week about the difference between collectivist and I'm sorry, collectivist and individualistic cultures, right? There are some differences there as to how we walk and talk and develop those skills. All right. So again, I'm not going to go through the learning objectives here. But we're going to start off with our talk of Jean Piaget and his approach to cognitive development. Now, Jean Piaget, he was born right around the end of about 1890, and he died about 1980. So he lived a pretty long life. And he continued to be an influence much into the development of psychology and our understanding of child development, much into 50s, 60s, and 70s, and then even beyond that, because we still use elements of his theory. We don't use them all. We're finding that some of it was a little antiquated, but it was very groundbreaking for his time. And we really consider Jean Piaget to be the father of cognitive development, just based on his work that he did. But one of the most influential parts of his theory was the development of the four stages. So he considered across the board, and he kind of really asserted that this happens in different cultures and different countries and different parts of the world, is that we all go through four universal stages, and that's the sensory motor, the pre-operational, the concrete operational, and the formal operational stages. Okay, we're really going to spend a lot of our time this morning talking about the sensory motor, because again, it applies. We see the sensory motor stage happen from around 0 to 2 years of age. And then pre-operational is about 2 to 7, and then concrete operational from 7 to 11, and then formal operational about 12 years on up. And we're going to be going through, you can write those down now. I'm going to be touching upon these much later. Now, one thing I do want to point out with some of these theories that we're going to be talking about is you're going to hear me throwing out numbers like 0 to 2 years of age, 2 to 7 years of age. These are not hard and fast rules. Again, psychology is not a hard science, so we can't say that something happens. 1 + 1 doesn't always equal 2 in psychology, like it might in chemistry or geology or biology or something. We don't have 100% times that something occurs, because we're all different. We're a collection of infinite experiences and thoughts and genetics, right? So no one of us is going to be exactly the same. We're going to be close, but that's what we look at with norms and stuff. So on average, we're saying right around 0 to 2 years of age, we're going to see this stage. Some children might progress faster. Some might progress slower. If they progress slower, we may want to consider looking at it, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we have a formal diagnosis or an issue. It just might mean that we need to observe it a little bit longer and see if there are any other factors that might be popping up that are indicative of problems. Okay. So anyway, a lot of the time we're going to be spending is 0 to 2 years of age, and that's going to be in the sensory motor as we're talking about Piaget. Now, a couple key terms that Piaget helped to really coin into not only our routines and our cognitive development, but also our personalities. Okay, he developed the idea of schemas. So schema, and I know your book had a nice little formal definition, and I can't recall what that was, but it was along the lines of being able to put something into a routine or a category or a generalization. Okay. And what that's doing, and I think I may have mentioned this in other classes, our minds as humans are developed in a way that we are both lazy and that we are both prideful. Okay. Now I say lazy because it's a 4-letter word. It's an easy word to say, but I say that most lovingly, because we as humans, we strive to be simple. We strive to have routine. We strive to make things easier in our lives. Why would we want to do that? Why are our minds wired to do that, do you think?
Because life is complex and we try to make it simpler to handle, to live.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yep. And it comes from our animalistic instincts. And if you look at evolution, like evolutionary psychology, this is a basic function for us, because if we're spending so much time with chaos and just exerting our mental energy on different things all the time, that doesn't leave much room for us to really focus on threats in our environments, right? Or poisons or things. We need to really make sure that we're safe at all times. We're kind of like a walking security system for ourselves, right? So one of the things we like to do is we like to put things into routines and clump things together. And that's kind of what I mean by our laziness is we just want things to be easy. We want things to happen with some kind of predictability. So that way we can free up our mental resources for things that are more important, that are more maybe potentially life threatening. So that's kind of what I mean by that. And that's what a schema is being able to package something nicely into a little box or a bin so that we can identify it a little bit easier. And one of and I think your book used some examples of how that's done. But for example, if I were to give you a picture of I'm trying to think of an apple and a pear. Okay. If I were to show an infant an apple and a pear, do you think that that child might have a hard time really differentiating between the two of them?
Yeah.
Probably, right? Because they kind of look the same, especially if you have a green apple or an orangish pear. They look very similar. So it would be very easy for a child to really put that into a schema and call them both apples, because apple is probably more the common term. It wouldn't be much until later, until we start expanding those bins into more specific areas. Like, for example, maybe it tastes a little bit different. A pear is a little bit sweeter and less tart than an apple. Maybe it has a slightly different shape. Maybe it has a slightly different texture. It feels differently. You know, the skins feel a little bit differently. So it's not until we start making those schemas a little bit more complex until that child is really able to start differentiating between finer things. And you might see that. You might see that many of you may have worked with children or have children of your own, and they see something with I'm kind of relating this back to my kids is my son used to call things goggies. He loved anything that had four legs, and it could even be a cat. And but what he did was he assumed that everything that has four legs, he had that bin that said four legs, and animal was a doggy or a dog, and he called them goggies. So it wouldn't be uncommon for him to see a cow in the pasture as we're driving by and yelling out goggy, okay, which is perfectly natural and perfectly normal. Now, and as we get into some of our talks a little bit later, especially with forming language and how to direct that speech and correct them in a way that it's not offensive, that it's not going to induce some kind of mistrust or fear that they can't be wrong, but helping them and guiding them to spread out that schema a little bit more so that their language and that their generalization can get a little bit more complex. Okay.
My niece kind of does the same thing,
Mhm.
but when it comes to chocolate milk and anything that could potentially look like chocolate milk,
Oh,
therefore we can't drink iced coffee around her
okay.
because like she literally has chased me through the house screaming.
Oh man, she's going mental over the chocolate milk, huh?
It's my mom's fault, but
Okay.
she like we literally can't have iced coffee, at least not in a clear container around
Okay.
her. And even in like an opaque container like the one that I use, it's still like she just needs to have everybody's drink.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, just so it could be, and it's not necessarily a bad thing, but anything that's like brown and opaque and liquidy might be bad for her.
It's all chocolate milk to her.
Yeah.
And she's very
Yeah.
much in the what's mine and is mine and what's yours is mine
Yeah. Oh, that's
stage of toddlerhood.
those stages are fun. but but they get through them. I mean, that's the thing, and that's part of the schema thing is that they'll start to differentiate. And part of her journey through this is going to be to understand that not all things that are brown, liquid, opaque are for her. Okay, at some point things are going to be a little bit different, and if adult has a certain type of glass, then it's probably not for her, right? So these are the things that the children start to learn over time, and they start to expand these schemas through a process that Piaget had coined as assimilation and accommodation. Okay, So assimilation, and the best way to really refer to these two is, or to compare these two, is assimilation is taking what we know and trying to adopt the novel ideas into what we know. Okay, so for example, I think I use the example of my son thinking anything with four legs and upright is a dog, right? So he was taking what he knew of a dog and saying, okay, well, that animal out there, that entity, that organism has four legs and it acts like a dog, it looks like a dog. There are probably some differences, but for the most part, I'm going to think that that's a dog. And that's what he's doing with assimilation. Now, accommodation is a little bit different. Accommodation is bending your understanding of something to start incorporating novel ideas. Okay, so you're changing your understanding, whereas assimilation, you're standing by your understanding and not really expanding it all. Okay, so accommodation would be my son, would be that learning moment when I was talking with my son saying, well, that's not necessarily a dog. I mean, it has four legs, but it makes a different sound. It's a little bit bigger. It's got a different tail. It's it's a different animal, and start expanding that knowledge, that understanding a little bit for him to start keying in, saying, "Oh, well, maybe not everything with four legs is a dog." And what that does is that starts to breed questions. So he may see another four-legged animal and he would think automatically, this is where we start branching out, is okay, well, just because they have four legs and they're upright doesn't necessarily mean that they're all dogs. Okay, so there's kind of like this Boolean algebra that occurs. So he'll start asking questions. Well, if a cow's not a dog and I see a different animal that looks a little bit differently than a dog and a cow, then maybe this is something different too. And then that's where the questions start to form is, well, what is that? And you'll see kids do that. That's when they become very inquisitive, because everything that they knew in those schemas are not, and that they can't assimilate, are now starting to expand through accommodation, and they'll start asking questions. Well, why? What is that? What is that? And then we go through that stage. Okay. So that's really what we see through the sensory motor stage, is these schemas start to form through assimilation and accommodation. Okay. All right. So within the sensory motor stage, which is the first stage of Jean Piaget's cognitive development theory, we break this down for infants. We break this down into 6 different stages, subsets. And we do that because there are many things that are going on. And like I talked in previous classes, when children are born, their minds are just primed and ready, and they're ready to build and start putting things together and start learning. That's a majority of where the learning occurs, either with movement or with learning how to adapt their senses. It occurs within that 0 to 2 months period. So we'll talk about some of these 6 stages and why they're important within this period. Individual differences in the rate of progression. So there are, again, this could be for cultural reasons, this could be for genetics, but there might be different rates of progression through some of these stages. It might be availability. And if a child is not in a learning rich environment, they may be stunted with some of these stages because they're not permitted to experiment. One of the other cool things that I meant to bring up a little earlier when I was given a background about Jean Piaget is he looked at children, he kind of broke away from the model of looking at all organisms as we're just born to grow. We just eat and then we grow and then we do things. And then what he did is he simplified his model of looking or observing children as looking at them as little scientists. And what this assertion did is it really broke us out of the mold of thinking that we're just like cats and dogs, right? We come out, we nurture, and then we kind of figure things out later. He said, no. Immediately, even within the womb, children we have this curiosity switch within us. We have this hope to discover something, this hope to investigate what doesn't make sense. And this kind of goes back into how it's built into us that we want to build these routines. Okay, so they want to become little investigators. They want to become little scientists. And if you think about that, we have a pretty good understanding of physics before we've even taken a physics class much into middle school or high school, right? Now, what do I mean by that? What do you think I mean that we have an idea about physics before
Um,
that?
I hope this is physics, but like gravity, the law of gravity,
Yeah,
things like that, that we just kind of figure out on our own.
The
absolutely.
drums
There is a
again.
cognitive development in the brain we are expecting from the kids to understand those kind of things.
Well, they already understand these things. They don't have the terminology and they may not have the formulas, but for the most part, we come out knowing how the world works. We know from our very first attempt to get on our feet, crawling, going from a crawling stage to a walking, or in my case, immediately running stage. It's very difficult for us to break the bonds of gravity, because we feel it, right? If we lose our footing or we lose our step, what happens? We go down. So we learn early on what gravity does. We learn earlier on that that light comes from where?
The sun.
Or above, right? It comes from the sky. So there are certain things that we build in. We know that if wind, we may not understand wind velocity or aerial resistance or anything like that, but we know if there's a big gust of wind and we got a coat on, it's going to sail us up, right? We're going to probably lose our footing and either fall down or get pushed back or something. So we learn these laws, these fundamental laws of physics at an early age before we're even taught what they are. So anyway, there are different rates of progression. My point in that was we have different rates of progression based on what we've experienced. And if we lead a sheltered life, that we don't see the sun very much, or like individualistic, or I'm sorry, in collectivist third world countries where children aren't expected to be independent so long, they may not be allowed or promoted to walk and explore things. So they may take a little bit longer to get through some of these stages. Okay. So one of the other things to note with the sensory motor stages, the transition between stages include characteristics of previous and subsequent stages. So what this is talking about is that with these stage theories is that in order to get to this next substage or this next stage within these theories, we have to acquire certain skills. Otherwise, it doesn't really work, right? So, for example, we're not going to master walking until we've mastered an understanding of how gravity works. We're not going to go out and try and seek out something if we think that it just vanishes into thin air, right? And that's kind of what takes us to our substages here. So our substage one is simple reflexes. This is more physiological. We're starting to connect learning with how our movement, our body movements are occurring. And this can come through certain aspects, certain factors such as sucking, right? I mean, what is the purpose of a child developing a sucking routine?
Food. Eating.
Right. Nourishment, basic nourishment. Because if we don't have nourishment, and we'll get into this when we talk about motivation, if we don't have nourishment within our bodies, we start developing hunger pangs, right? We go through a negative physical sensation until our body is satiated in some way through the use of food. So using sucking reflexes, they've linked through learning to know that when I do this, then somebody feeds me, and that hunger pang dissipates, so we don't have that anymore, right? So that happens like within the first month of life, is that these reflexes start to excuse me start to form. So once we're satiated and things are good, our body is nourished, and we start to wonder about the world around us. We start having other needs, like where is mom, where is dad, where are these things that are comforting me, because now that I'm full, my belly's good, I need to start exploring the world a little bit on my own. That's where we start observing these first habits of primary circular reactions. So I like to use the analogy of kind of like a spiral. Okay, so at the very center of this, we have our basic reflexes. Okay, that puts us into homeostasis. That puts us into a state of feeling safe and secure for the most part. And then as we feel safe, we start to go outside that a little bit. Okay, so outside of that initial point of being satiated and satisfied, we start to explore. And that's what happens in the sub stage is children start, or infants start to coordinate their finer tune actions. They'll start grabbing things. Okay, they'll start feeling around for things. They'll start looking around for things, and they'll start combining that with their muscle movements, like grasping things. Okay, or biting on things. Okay, they start using their physical senses a lot more to understand that when they do, something in their environment happens. So when they cry, somebody comes to look at them, or pick them up, or feed them, or something. So they're starting to learn that what they do, their behaviors, spawns a reaction somewhere in their environment.
So was Piaget the one who established the hierarchical development theory, or was that around before him?
That was after him. That was Abraham Maslow, which we will talk about the hierarchy of needs. And I'm glad you brought that up, because this really does apply here too. Okay, because when we do have the hierarchy of needs state, that our first stage is what? Biological needs. We need our biological needs before anything else can happen. And then we seek safety and shelter. So if you were looking at Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you would see a very similar representation here, where our biological needs are met. So now I'm going to explore a little bit. Okay, my motivation is to go out and figure out the environment around me. A very good correlation. I like how you use that. I was thinking that as I was saying this too. I just didn't want to confuse you. So anyway, we see this primary circular reaction happen from about 1 to 4 months of age. And again, this is just very basic. They're starting to reach out. They may not even necessarily know what they're grabbing onto, but they're exploring the worlds around them through the use of their senses. As they become a little bit more learned in their abilities to acquire certain things, like maybe a bottle or something, just even having a bottle put onto their mouth and them grabbing it and understanding that now they have a little bit of control, they're starting to master repetitive movement within their digits, within their fingers and within their extremities. Okay. What we'll start to see after that, once they start to become more proficient in doing that, so every time you put a bottle up to their lips and they grab it, we're going to start to see something a little bit more like secondary circular reactions. And this happens from about 4 to 8 months, where they're exhibiting even more control. So they may start, we're going to see more repetitive actions with this, and even finer tune skills with it. So instead of just picking up the bottle, they may start to move the bottle away when they're done. All right. They may throw it away or get rid of it. They'll understand that I can not only grasp it, but I can release it. Okay. They may pick up a baby rattle, and instead of just grabbing it, they'll start to shake it. And that's what we'll see with the secondary circular reactions, is more fine-tuned and purposeful abilities through their motor skills. Okay. And then from around 8 to 12 months, we'll see coordination of better coordination of their secondary circular reactions. So they'll start to interact with their toys a lot more. Okay. They'll start to push them out, pull them in, reach for another toy that they want. Okay. And they're going to start to master something that we call object permanence. Now, object permanence, if any of you have ever interacted with a child, you've probably inadvertently stumbled into object permanence. What is a baby's favorite game, would you say, at a young age? Like one of their first favorite games to play, and even adults? Huh?
Peekaboo.
Peekaboo, absolutely, right? Because what we're doing with peekaboo is we're really entertaining the child by making ourselves reappear. Okay.
Object permanence.
Object permanence, absolutely. That's right. And what happens with object permanence is the child has not yet mastered mental representation. Now, mental representation is something that it's a bookish answer, but it's really something that we take for granted. But we all have a very strong developed mental representation. And I know this because all of you are here today. And if you didn't have a good grasp on mental representation, then chances are you probably weren't able to turn on your computer today. But what mental representation is being able to hold an image in our thought, regardless of what else is going on around us, right? So, for example, if I gave you, if I said car, who can describe a car to me? Who can give me a description of car?
Box has wheels.
Okay, a box has wheels. Okay, all right.
And doors.
Okay. Well, and some of you that might be a little bit more descriptive. You could have said like something that has 4 doors, 4 wheels, and a trunk, or something like a motor, or something like that. But what we're doing is just me even saying that word is developing an image in your head. It's conjuring up an image of your head from whatever experiences you've had with cars. Okay, so what you're doing is you're engaging in mental representation. Children from birth are still developing that mental representation. So they may see your face and they associate your face with joy and happiness and nurturing and comfort. And when that face goes away, they're sad for a moment, but they don't really understand that you still exist. Okay. And we see that with toys. There's a lot of experiments, and I think I have some picture or some videos up on our D2L resources that depict this. So when a child's toy goes missing, they don't look for it anymore. Okay. They don't understand that it's gone. It's out of the picture for now, but it could come back. To them, it no longer exists. Okay. So there's no searching in this until they start to develop their coordination of secondary circular reactions. When they understand that they can start to manipulate their environment, and they've seen over time that when something goes away and it comes back exactly as it went away as, then maybe it exists somewhere. Again, that's that scientist mentality of them. They start to interact a little bit more and say, well, where'd it go? Maybe if I cry, it'll come back. Okay. Or maybe if I reach over and push that piece of paper out of the way, or whatever's hiding it, I can find that. And that's really where coordination of secondary circular reactions, we're starting to see that formulate a little bit more solidly, when they start to grasp searching for things that previously they would have thought just never existed or just ceased to exist anymore. Okay. And from there, after we see them develop that object permanence, the development of the object permanence, we'll see tertiary circular reactions from about 12 to 18 months, which they will start to do things much more purposely and much more fine-tuned. Okay. And then we'll start to really form solid mental representations beginning with the beginnings of thought from about 18 months to 2 years of age. Okay. And this is really identified as, you might see children that are throwing things. Okay. They're starting to act beyond whatever their reach is. Okay. Because at that stage, to that point, everything that they do is within their reach, within their minds, and anything outside of that doesn't really exist or doesn't really matter. But we're going to start to see that matter in about sub-stage 6 of Piaget's sensory motor stage. And they may start throwing objects around. They may start slamming things. They start understanding that there is a world outside of their touch, and that really takes form around stage 6. Excuse me. Apologize. So one of the criticisms of Jean Piaget's cognitive model is that it doesn't really account for gradual or continuous growth. Okay. How Jean Piaget developed his model is that it's very stage specific. So it happens, it can't happen until one thing occurs. So a child will not look for an object that until object permanence has been established. And we kind of know that. Now, there's some evidence that refutes that children search while they're developing object permanence, their ability to overcome object permanence. Okay, so that just because they are searching doesn't necessarily mean that they've established that something goes away and it still exists. Okay, they could just be developing these searching tools. So anyway, that was one of the criticisms of his staged theory, is that not necessarily the next stage doesn't necessarily depend on the stage prior, but it is a good indication as to how they're going to negotiate future stages, if that makes sense. All right. I already talked about these, and here's and again, I have a couple examples within D2L that give you some video examples of how object permanence occurs, and we're going to see some of these examples later as well. Okay. All right. So with looking at Piaget's model with sensory motor, we do see that there was a lot of support, and many of you that have children or have worked with children, you probably can see why some of these stages are still appropriate today, right? He was a pioneer in the field, and he really developed a lot of these ideas through observation. And for the most part, we can see them cross-culturally around the planet. However, again, there are certain limiting factors. You know, are we a collectivist culture? Are we individualistic culture? Are we capitalists? Are we a village? Do we have like a smaller village where walking could equate to, or exploration could equate to premature death, right? So there is a lot of support that we see that there is a tendency to do that, but it could oftentimes be stifled either through culture, or through cultural values or beliefs, or something like that. All right. And some of the challenges on here, I'm just going to highlight a couple of these. The stage concept was questioned. When I say that, I'll kind of delineate this because we're going to talk more about instead of having stages, like having stage specific theories, which Piaget obviously is. So a stage theory is very much like, again, very distinct stages. So if we, to use an analogy, we look at a caterpillar, right? We have a caterpillar who turns into a butterfly. There are different stages that a caterpillar goes through. It goes through the larva stage, goes through the metamorphic stage, through building a cocoon and forming in that cocoon. And then the third stage is to flourish as a butterfly, right? Very specific, very observable, and very distinct stages. Other theorists said, well, that may be good for certain things, but there might be some abilities that are developed differently. Okay. And we do know this, and we can kind of see this, especially with social growth. There aren't really distinct stages that a person goes through social growth. We do know that it's a continuous growing process. So to use an analogy for continuous growth, that would be equivalent to like a tree. We don't see specific trees. We may see certain budding occur at certain times, but for the most part, we just see this gradual growth until it becomes a mature tree. And that's kind of what the difference is between stage theorists and continuous theorists, okay? So one of the criticisms is that not everything is a stage theory, which Piaget believed. Everything happens in increments, happens in stages. We do also know that object permanence can occur earlier under certain conditions, okay? And we've seen that with children that have expectations of something to happen. So for example, if they moved an object behind a screen and then had it emerge as that same object later, doing that over time will create an expectation much earlier that child can expect that something disappears and it reappears again. So object permanence can happen much earlier than 1 to 2 years of age, or 18 months to 2 years. And I think that's all I really have about that slide. All right. Let's see, information processing. Let's see if there's anything on this slide that I want. So when we think of information processing, what we're talking about is the formation of memories, okay? And memories are important, as we're going to talk about later this week, because memories set up the stage for learning. Now, learning, we can measure. Can we measure memory? What do you think?
I guess so.
No.
No?
Aren't there cognitive tests that they give particularly to the elderly?
Mhm.
Yeah, like the one Trump took with the baby people stage. What did he? The
Okay.
Elephant.
human child person camera.
Yeah. So what are we measuring there? What are we measuring? When are we measuring memory, or are we measuring learning?
I think you're measuring more learning and like
Right.
the learning cognition and stuff like that.
And when we get into Wednesday, this will make a little bit more sense. But when we measure learning, we know learning occurs because a behavior that we're observing happens again to get a similar result or change the result that was unfavorable. Okay. So that's how we measure learning, is we see a repetitive behavior with the goal of either reducing something unpleasant or gaining something rewarding. Okay. Memory, however, is not necessarily really, we can only observe memory through learning, if that makes sense. Okay. So we have no idea, like for right now, for example, right now, I have no idea how many of you are actually absorbing what I'm telling you. The only way that I'm going to be able to test your memory is by looking at your learning. I can do that through quizzes. I can do that through conversation. I can ask you a direct question and see how you respond. So there are ways that I can measure learning, but memory is a very, very hard thing to really establish. Okay, and one of the ideas that we have about memory, and again, it's not a science. We don't have little electrodes that we put in our heads and say we can see that from the time that this person heard something, this child heard something, to the time that they formed it into their short-term memory and then put it into the long-term memory has occurred. We can't test that. We can see through imagery, we can see certain activities happen, but we don't even know what those are. Okay, we're still in our infancy in understanding exactly how memory occurs and how it fails, for that matter. Okay, but one of the approaches that we do use is information processing. And it's probably the most popular one, and the one that I like to present for this class, because it's very simplistic. It makes a lot of sense, and it helps. And hopefully I do have. And it'll relate it to what you know of the computer world around us. And in a lot of ways, we've developed computers in the way that we understand our own abilities and our own minds, don't we? Right? So, for example, the information processing model suggests that we have 3 stages that we can use to put information in, store it, and then get it out of there, which is encoding, storage, and retrieval. Encoding, just like it sounds, it's the process by which the information is initially recorded. So if we look at a computer model here, we can see that information gets into a computer by way of what? Either through a camera, microphone. This is showing a keyboard, a mouse, something. It takes me as the individual with the information to produce that information in one of these forms, in an input capacity. Okay. Once we get that information in, it's processed for what's important, what's not important. Now, in the case of a computer, everything you do gets recorded. With humans, not so much. Okay. There are billions of things that are happening around us, from it could be 1,000 tree or leaves rustling in the tree right now. There could be bugs flying around or crawling around. There could be cars going by. There could be, right now I have somebody mowing right outside my house, And luckily, my brain isn't poised to look at that as a priority and focus on that, because otherwise I wouldn't be able to talk to you right now. So we do this kind of vetting thing as to what's important to us and what's not. So it's not like a computer where everything gets recorded. And when we talk about like visualizations and imagery and mental imagery, we don't record things like we would on a hard drive or a tape or something either. We don't store things verbatim. We store them in symbolism and representation. So anyway, my point in that is everything that we do on a computer gets recorded. Everything that we do through our senses, our five senses, doesn't. Okay, we rack and stack based on priority. But once we do find that something is important to us that we need to pay attention to, it goes into our working memory, where we start to manipulate it a little bit and rehearse it. And then it eventually goes into our storage, our long-term storage, our long-term memory. Okay. And then how we can really test to see if something was successfully encoded and stored is through the process of recovering that information in the retrieval process. Okay. So that's basically the information processing. And let's see.
Sometimes brain use that like as a defense system, like very crucial time it just forgets. Like if you had some like event really was so harmful, like you saw something like in like had the car crash or something, and you don't forget. I mean, you forget everything about it, and you just don't remember.
Yeah.
Is that something about that? Like is it related to about the?
Yes, absolutely. And when we're a child, remember, like we're kind of developing our laziness as we get a little bit older, right? Because we're trying to put things into box, we're trying to make things into a routine and make things more sensible to us. So everything that a child is just being bombarded with all sorts of stimuli, and it's amazing about many of the infants are able to track much of what is going on in their environment around them. So they have this super, and that's why we need those 200 billion neurons initially, is because we're being bombarded with everything and we need to pay attention. So they are hyper vigilant and they are aware of things that that most people that we, as we get a little bit older, take for granted. But absolutely, I mean, they start assigning, I mentioned earlier, we think in terms of symbols, we think in terms of emotions. When they start to feel, when they start to develop feelings and emotions, they'll start to feel certain ways about things, and they'll start to remember those in terms of how it makes them feel. It could be a positive experience, it could be a negative experience, and for two people, it could be completely different experiences, right? So what one person feels about something happening. Now, for example, I've being in the military for so many years, I've seen a lot of things, and for somebody to see a village getting bombed on the news, right, which is a very terrible thing to happen, might be devastating for somebody to watch on TV. Whereas for me, I've seen it, sadly to say, I've seen it hundreds of times. And it doesn't mean that I feel less about it. It just means that I'm not going to have the same type of feelings or same intensity of feelings as somebody that's watching it on the news as I'm watching it on the news, if that makes sense. So anyway, we do have these little bit of differences, and we do remember things based on how we feel about them. Okay. But for infants, as they're starting to develop this, they start to build those memory capabilities. Okay. And we do see that. And we look at that through learning. Yeah. How are they taking that square block and trying to put it into a round hole somehow? Are they able to start to show reasoning? Maybe they had that round block into the round hole before, and based on that position, they know to do that again. So based on that, we can start to see these memory capabilities start to develop. Duration of memories at a young age isn't very long, okay? Unless it's something that can be repeated over time and time again. Children, for the most part, if it's a 1 or 2 time incident that happens, like maybe something that scares them, maybe something that dropped, or maybe they fell, that's not going to have a lasting impact on them. It may be traumatic, and it may guard that we may see develop behaviors from them, protecting from having that happen again, especially if it's harmful to them. But for the most part, we do see that their memory is pretty plastic at that point, and they can tend to forget things that are traumatizing. Okay. So my point is, like, a 2-year-old that maybe falls down a flight of stairs may not remember that later because they don't really understand what happened. Okay. If that makes sense.
Does that depend on the degree of the trauma? Like, for example, the article I reviewed, it was about this thing called still face, where they had the mothers play with their babies and then turn around and then turn back with this like totally no expression.
Mhm.
And for 3 minutes, they weren't allowed to react to their babies. So they were looking at how the babies reacted to that. And it just seemed to me like imagining that sequence of like playing with your mom and she's happy and you're getting along. And then all of a sudden she turns back with this like creepy face.
Mhm.
It seemed like that could be something that's traumatic. Is it like, so for example, compared to falling down the stairs,
Mhm.
something that's like that kind of more personal about developing trust, would that be more likely to be remembered later on? If it happens like 3 different times in your growth period.
It would really probably depend on first of all, the age, because we do know we have a lot of studies that show that children really don't start to master their emotions until much beyond 3 years old. They don't really pick up language. They're starting to pick up language around 1.5. But it's very basic. They haven't assigned emotion to that, and the meaning of those symbols isn't really as intact as they would need to be in order for them to remember something traumatic that happens to them. And that's why we really estimate that the earliest memory that many of us have is probably around 4 years old, give or take a year. Some of you maybe a little bit longer. But when we start assigning language and emotion and meaning to those symbols, that's where the rubber meets the road. And that's kind of where we are today, because we use language to elicit memories, don't we? So if we're a child that hasn't mastered language, then it's going to be hard to elicit any kind of memories that happen prior to us mastering that language at around 3 or 4 years old. Does that answer your question?
It does, but I wonder if just because they may not remember, so theoretically they don't remember what happened, could it still affect them?
It could affect their behaviors. Like, for example, if a child, I'm going to stop sharing here. If a child, and we're going to talk about this when we get into psychosocial development with Erik Erikson's theories. If a child does not feel secure, like, for example, when they cry, are they fed? If they want nurturing, are they cuddled? If these things aren't happening, we could see patterns develop in their behavior of instability or mistrust. And that could set them up for later learning deficiencies later. Like I said, that with that circular pattern, the only time that these circular patterns happen is when a child is satiated. Those basic needs are met. If they're not feeling safe and secure, we see a tendency for them to not try and explore their environment a little bit more liberally. And when we get into Harlow monkey experiments later, we'll see that too. We'll see that the more secure that the child is, the more that they're going to venture out and explore things. Whereas if they're insecure and they're frightful or fearful, then they're going to try and find something to cling to, which could stunt their growth and even their memory later on in life if they're too anxious to try and focus. So anyway, yeah, good points there, and it definitely leads us into further talks here. I know we're running up on time. Anybody have any questions so far just regarding the material before I stop recording? Okay. So for Thursday,